So, hi everyone, welcome to Durham. So there's some public here in the room and somebody else hopefully online. I don't know how many.
30 people apparently.
Oh, very good. So Richard has asked me to introduce him as the speaker for today, which is a great pleasure for me. So Richard did his PhD at Oxford and then spent some time at Leeds and University College of London. And now he's an assistant professor at Earth Sciences in Durham since 2016. And so I was just looking at him. With him, he's got numerous awards for Earth Science and his research, among which the Keith Runcorn Prize from the Royal Astronomical Society, and about 10 other awards, which I'm not going to cite all of them. And then he has numerous times also intervened on the BBC and written an article for Times, which is outreach papers on earthquakes, and in particular on the sequence of earthquakes in Italy in 2016, which is the topic that he's going to talk about today. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Stefan. Should we dim the lights? Dim the lights down. Okay, so hopefully you guys can hear me okay and can see me okay. And obviously you guys can, because you're right here. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about seismic sequences today. And there we go. Right, and I'm going to start off actually by mentioning, or by talking about continental fault networks. Okay, and so these are the complex networks of faults that host earthquakes that are spread across distributed zones of deformation in the continents. We're interested in these regions because actually this is where the largest seismic hazard lies. Okay, so globally, this is a graph that shows by earthquake magnitude, the amount of fatalities from different types of earthquakes. In pink, those in the continents, and in blue, subduction zone events at plate boundaries. So those subduction zone events are larger. It's actually the earthquakes, the smaller magnitude earthquakes in the continents that kill more people globally. And it's these ones that are kind of more unpredictable because they take place on these distributed networks, they're often quite complex, of faults. Okay. So faults in the continents commonly segmented, broken up into these kind of short sections, and actually this segment length is well known to be limited, to be capped essentially, but in a way that relates to the thickness of the seismogenic crust, something that's relatively stable on a global basis. So what we can see here, this is data from Jan Klinger's 2010 paper and from an undergraduate student of mine, Ashley Mason, for normal faulting earthquakes and strike slip earthquakes, so the maximum length of an individual segment versus earthquake magnitude. And what we can see is that gradually this increases with increasing size of earthquakes, but actually at some point it kind of plateaus off. And so even at very big earthquakes, we're still capped at 20 kilometers or so segment length. And this really matters because earthquake magnitude, earthquake size, is related directly to the amount of area, or the area that slips in an earthquake. Okay, so if we have a limit on that segment length and also a limit down dip based on that seismogenic thickness, then we have a fixed limit of our area for an individual segment. Because the magnitude of an earthquake relates to the area of the fault that slips, that means we have a cap on the amount of the size of an earthquake we can host on an individual segment. So therefore we can think about fault failure, fault network failure, so failure of multiple segments within a network, as on two end members. We could fail one individual segment in an earthquake, and so therefore we get a small earthquake. Okay, that might be capped an individual segment at magnitude 6, 6.5, something like that. Or we could have the biggest earthquakes, which actually fail multiple segments. So it might be cascading failure in a matter of seconds of multiple segments together, and that generates a large earthquake. But actually, although I've shown these two M members here, it's actually probably more likely a continuum, okay? So actually, we could think about how else we might have multiple segments failing close in space and time, but not in seconds, but instead spread maybe over days or weeks or months or years. Okay, so still clustered together spatially and temporally, but actually, so that time is short still in relation to the average recurrence interval of earthquakes on individual faults, which would be typically hundreds of years or thousands of years. Okay, so even if they're spaced together by a year or so, that's still short in comparison to that recurrence interval. Okay, and the important thing here is that actually the initial conditions for either of these two situations, either a very big earthquake that fails multiple segments, or some kind of sequence, multiple segments popping off together over a few years, the initial conditions are essentially the same. And that is that you have your segments that fail are all near critically stressed, right? So they're all pretty much right at the point of failure. And it's thought that this is actually quite common in nature. It's more common than you'd expect from random chance, because actually there's some kind of stress synchronization process over multiple earthquake cycles, whereby neighboring segments approach that point of criticality together. So in some regards then, we can consider these sequences as failed big earthquakes. Okay? Everything was primed, these multiple segments were primed, ready to go. One earthquake started on one segment, but it didn't jump across to the neighbouring ones. It didn't rupture through. Okay, so it stopped. And that's kind of a paradigm through which we're going to look at the rest of this talk. So the largest episodes then of strain release in the continents, and therefore also hazard, come from one of these two end members. Or not my end members, one of these two forms of multi-segment rupture. We can either get a seismic sequence. Okay, so we have one fault failing, one segment failing, another one, and then a third over days, weeks, or it can all go in one go. And the important thing here is there's actually major associated differences in hazard. Either you get one big earthquake, which will have larger amount of shaking, bigger effects, more damage probably, but it's all over relatively quickly. Or actually you can get a more moderate hazard, represented by several smaller, but probably still quite large earthquakes, but then actually might be quite protracted and dragged out over years. And that can have a big effect, for example, if you've already got building damage and when a building is hit again sometime later for reconstruction efforts, etc. So it's important to know when one occurs or when the other occurs. So I've got four main questions I'm going to pose in the talk today. The first is, what causes rupture to stop? Okay, so if you've got that same initial conditions, why does it stop? Why do we get a big earthquake sometimes? Why do we get a sequence sometimes? And then also that is the same question as saying what determines the size of those individual sub-events? Second one, what causes rupture to start again? So once it has stopped, why does it then start up again, and what is that trigger? How important are these on a global scale? So actually, how much of the moment budget they release, how common are they in relation to sort of big earthquakes? And are there any variations between different tectonic regions? So are these equally common globally, or actually is there some variation there? Again, this is important for seismic hazard, but also actually understanding if there are variations, why there are variations, might give us information on particularly number one, why actually the rupture is stopping in the first place and why get in one mode or the other. So I'm going to address this in two main ways today. First, I'm going to give a case study of one individual sequence, a series of earthquakes in central Italy in 2016. And then I'm also going to do some global analysis of an earthquake catalogue to think about these events in general. This is stuff that was done, published a couple of years ago. This is stuff that was done on Friday. So it's actually, no, this is brand new results and is still preliminary to some extent. So that was a bit exciting bit at the end. Okay, so the 2016 Central Italy earthquake sequence is a series of 3 events. It's really important, and why it's an important case study is because really actually it's the first modern example of a seismic sequence. And what I mean by that is that it's the first one to occur in the modern age of data, where we have huge amounts of geological, seismological, and geodetic data. I'm focusing on the latter one here, so I'm focusing on INSAR datasets and GPS datasets and trying to constrain what happened in this earthquake sequence. So Italy here is extending at a rate of about 3 millimeters per year. It's about a tenth of the rate that your fingernails grow across Peninsula Italy there. And it's got a long history of seismicity, so there's normal faulting earthquakes in the region. This sequence started with a magnitude 6.2 earthquake down here in late August in 2016. Then that was followed about 2 months later by magnitude 6.1 up on the sort of further to the north here. And then just a couple of days later, after about 6.1, there was a 6.6 earthquake that happened somewhere in the middle. So my goal with this work really was to try and estimate on the faults that caused these events, what was the distribution of slip on those faults, and how do they relate to each other in space and in time. So that's my goal, is to estimate the distribution of slip throughout this sequence. And really I've got 4 kind of model time intervals that I'm going to try and constrain the slip in. Okay, so this is a timeline along the bottom in 2016. That's the first earthquake, the Amatrice, 6.2. Then there's this 2-month post-seismic period. So we've got 1, slip that I want to resolve, 2, the post-seismic period, 3, the second earthquake, the Visso earthquake, 6.1, and then 4, the Norwich earthquake, just a couple of days later, 6.6. Okay? So we've got 4 model time intervals and 18 geodetic data sets. So it's a huge amount of data in comparison to what we're used to looking at in individual earthquakes. And if this sequence had happened even just 10 years ago, then we actually probably wouldn't have been able to tease apart all the different events. We just would have been able to view the total deformation. It would be quite hard to disentangle. So what we've got is we've got a whole series of GPS data sets shown by the little circles here, which are measuring essentially the displacement in one individual earthquake. When we've also got these bars here, which are interferograms inside data sets, which essentially capture the spatial deformation field from the earthquake and what from any combination, from some combination of 1 or more earthquakes. So some of them constrain 1 earthquake, some of them constrain 2 or 3. So just an example here of what some of these look like. If we look at the pink one first, so that bar there, we can see when it covers the first earthquake, the post-seismic period, and the second one. This is what it looks like here. At the top, I can't quite reach because I'm short, is the signal from the second earthquake, the Visso one. This signal here is from the Amatrice from the first earthquake. We can see quite clearly there's 2 kind of separate, spatially separate signals. This one in green here contains the second earthquake up here, that's the signal there, and then the very large one, 6.6. And this one also contains those 2. So we've got a large number of data sets. That's just an example of what they look like in detail. That's those same ones then put into context with all the rest of the data sets. And this is then the GPS vectors associated with that. So you can see all of these are highlighting just this first earthquake only, and then we've got some combination of the others. And the approach that I use to try and disentangle these is something that we actually developed for the South Napa earthquake in California, which is essentially to set this up as one huge linear inversion where we let each data set constrain some combination of those different model intervals. Okay. So there are some details of this approach in here. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but actually it's been written up more nicely than I've written it up by Thea Regon, who's just published a paper that has kind of quite a lot of the details of the method, and she's put it in the sub-Bayesian implementation. But what's quite nice here is that we can constrain all of these slip distributions in one attempt. Again, try and partition which signals are coming from which event. But what we need to do first of all is we need to define the fault geometry, and this is kind of non-trivial for this event. It's a very complex region. Okay, so this is showing all the different faults, the aftershock patterns, and then in the thick coloured lines are my model faults, which are it's quite a complex model, but it's still a gross simplification of the actual structures that are on the ground. So again, I don't unfortunately have time to go into the way in which we constrained a lot of the details here, but what we used were a huge variety of data. So we used geological maps, we used the relocated aftershocks, which are shown there on the side. We used our own seismological solutions, which I'll show you briefly in a second. Surface ruptures from where some of these faults ruptured in the field. The geomorphology that has been shaped by these faults over time, and then actually the GPS and the INSAR data themselves. So for example, if there's a discontinuity in the INSAR data, then that might indicate where a fault reached the surface. But this is kind of the cartoon then of that fault geometry. The colours match the colours of these simplified faults here. But the most important thing to note is that we've got this kind of backbone of this west dipping normal fault here that starts up in the north, with the Vittoria fault. We've got the multiple segments, and then this Lager fault here in the south. So we've got mainly a west dipping normal fault system, and then with some minor synthetic antithetic faults, a big antithetic fault here, and some oblique one here that's cutting across. Okay, so just then I'm going to show you the recovered, I'm going straight to results to show you the recovered slip distributions on these faults. And I'm actually, again, only going to show you the really important bit for the purpose of this talk, which is, again, that main fault structure. So the Vittoria fault, red through orange, you can see the colour coding at the top of the fault there, red through orange, through lighter orange and yellow to the Lager fault in the south. Okay? And so that is the surface vent. We're looking sideways on. That's going down to 10 kilometers depth. And we can also see here the intersections of these other minor faults, again color-coded. So the big antithetic fault in light blue here, this minor green antithetic fault cutting in at a shallow angle, and then this oblique dark blue one then that's cutting across. So, talking you through then what happened in this sequence from these recovered slip distributions. The first earthquake started, the Amatrice earthquake started on the Lager fault at the south at that point A. It ruptured the Lager fault and jumped northwards onto the Vittoria fault, then stopped. The second earthquake, the Visso earthquake, 2 months later, then actually ruptured essentially the northern end of the Vittoria fault instead. And then finally, the Norcia earthquake, the big one, basically filled in the gap with a much higher slips. It was a much larger event, 6.6. And it did also re-rupture some of those earlier parts. And the mechanism, the magnitude, the centroid depths from these geodetic solutions are entirely consistent with our own seismological solutions that we've got from body wave modeling here, all normal faulting events. So the first two questions I posed, what causes rupture to stop and what causes rupture to start again? Now clearly we're not going to learn everything about all seismic sequences from one case study, but as I said, this is kind of the first case study that has this really, really good data set, so it's worth looking at what we think might have happened here. So that's then a summary of that sequence. Earthquake on the southern section, stops, northern section fails, and then the middle goes last, and those are the contours combined from that event. So focusing on why it stops, first of all, and thinking about the first earthquake to start with, the Amatrice 6.2 earthquake. What is quite obvious in the aftershock patterns, so these are the aftershocks, this is the main fault expression at the surface, that's the Vittoria and the Lager fault there, okay, is that actually there's kind of quite an oblique structure as well as that predominant trend of the aftershocks in that direction. There's quite an oblique structure as well in a more sort of north-northeasterly direction. And this is also represented in the geomorphology in the region. There's a sort of rhomb-shaped basins that show that there's other faults through in that trend. So what we've done then here is we've projected the seismicity within a certain distance onto the fault planes, onto this main fault plane along that trend. And what's quite interesting here, so there's quite a bit of scatter still in the data, but broadly speaking, if you look at the intersections of those, that antithetic fault, the minor antithetic fault, and in particular, this oblique structure here, they coincide pretty well with the aftershocks, but also with the termination, the northern termination of slip in that first event. So what we infer from this is that it's actually this oblique structure here that cuts through that caused that slip to terminate and rupture to halt in the first event. Even though clearly, given the size of the 6.6 earthquake and the fact that it was only 2 months later, there was a large amount of energy that was available there to be tapped into. That didn't happen. The rupture stopped there. We're inferring that's because of that oblique structure there. I should also just briefly note, so other authors have suggested different geometries from this. So what we've got back there is a kind of quite a steep normal fault. There is actually quite a inherited complex geometry of other faults in the region. So other people have proposed that actually there might be a thrust, an older thrust, but act as a barrier in this case. Actually, it doesn't massively matter, but our end result is the same. Although, so this is the geometry from Pizzi et al. In 2017. Although actually here we've got a steepened ramp of an older thrust. It can't just be shallow the whole way down. Otherwise, it doesn't fit the data. It doesn't fit the aftershock. So it has to be a steepened ramp, but that could very well be the case. It's probably quite likely actually. Even if it is a normal fault, it could be a reactivated steepened ramp. But what's interesting here is we also see something where we don't have anything mapped, where we have quite a similar looking pattern of aftershocks, a linear trend on the southern side of the Visso slip distribution, where we have this quite sharp termination of slip. So again, given what we see on the southern side, what we're inferring here is that there's actually an unknown, unmapped oblique structure in here with the same trend, but essentially have the same purpose, have the same function as the other oblique fault, and stop slip in the Visso earthquake. So what we're suggesting then is that it's oblique structures in both cases here, but have essentially partitioned the slip and stopped this from failing in one magnitude 6.7 earthquake. Instead, it's a 6.2, 6.1, or 6.6. So going on to why do we think this might have, how do we think this sequence started up again, particularly that 2-month wait? Why was there a 2-month pause? What determines that? So again, we're going to look at the aftershocks, but now we're going to look at the time evolution of them. And these are the aftershocks before the Visso earthquake. Okay, so all the aftershocks I've been showing you so far before the second earthquake. Okay, so they're these kind of ones highlighting this linear trend here on the side of the Visso patch. That is before that Visso earthquake happened. Okay, and what we can do then is we can plot these aftershocks. We can plot with them with distance from the highest point of slip, okay, on the preceding earthquake in this direction. And so this then is a plot of the aftershocks with distance from that red arrow and with time along the bottom here. And we can take the furthest, the kind of leading edge of 10% of aftershocks there, okay, in some window, and we've got them plotted there then on the slip distribution as those green circles. We can do then the same for a following bin with the light in light blue. So again, that's the next 10%, the leading edge. And again, we can plot them there. And we can do that again with dark blue, and again for a purple. So what we can see is a gradual progression northwards, both on the plot there and also on that. And we can plot the median distance in those bins. So you might be able to see these little triangles in this plot here, okay, that show this progression northwards. And it's actually been suggested from previous earthquakes in this region, in the L'Aquila earthquake in 2009 and the Umbrian Marsh earthquakes in 1997, that fluids may have had a strong role in triggering future earthquakes, driven by the stress changes essentially from preceding earthquakes. And so I wanted to test whether this was a plausible explanation. Oh, and the other really important thing to note, well, I didn't know, is that this is the hypercenter of the Visso earthquake, okay? And that's where it plots on this time curve, okay? So we can see that if we follow these little triangles up, then they reach that location just at the time the earthquake happened. So we can use a really simple model, which is just a 1D diffusion model, assuming that we've got diffusion of fluids driven by the stress changes, okay? And that is the curves here. And for some reasonable model, we can get a fit to the data and also something that arrives at that high percentages when that second earthquake is triggered. And if you assume something about the fluid, then it could be carbon dioxide or water, which has been suggested in the previous studies of earthquakes in this region. But actually, the permeabilities that you estimate for the material this fluids are travelling through is actually entirely consistent with the fractured limestone, which is the bedrock in the region. So it's kind of a plausible explanation. So what we're going to suggest then on this basis is that actually, and I've missed again something very important, which is that what I haven't said explicitly, but you may have noticed, is that of course these aftershocks, and therefore the fluids, are moving directly along these fault intersections, where we probably expect the rock to be highly fractured and damaged and maybe more permeable. So what I'm going to suggest on that basis then is that it's actually the same oblique cross-cutting structures that have caused the earthquakes to stop, but then channeling fluids driven by the stress changes from the first earthquake. They're moving along those intersections and triggering all these minor earthquakes, and then when we reach this high stress area here, it's obviously right at the critical threshold, they trigger the Visco earthquake. And so that then means that they're determining these oblique cross-cutting structures, be determining the size of the earthquakes by determining when rupture stops, but also the timing of that, particularly that 2-month gap, by channeling those fluids and triggering the next earthquake. So just to talk you through that then, here's our cartoon with some of the information stripped off. We've got our Lager fault in green in the south here, and the Mount Vittoria fault in the north. And we've got our intersecting structures. We start our sequence with this Amatrice earthquake on the Lager and South Vittoria faults. Then we have a 2-month interval where fluids are diffusing along these oblique intersections of these oblique faults in the main structures, triggering tiny aftershocks, and then this big earthquake on the 26th of October, a 2-month gap, 6.1. Again, the fault intersections, the same ones with fluids will be moving along, stop that rupture. And then finally, we get this 6.6 earthquake, but essentially is bounded. Sure, it propagates a little bit into this region, but essentially it's bounded by the stress shadows, the large-scale stress shadows from those 2 previous events. So it's these pre-existing minor faults that are potentially determining both the size and the timing of the earthquakes in this sequence. And of course, there's a big open question here, which is this kind of dual control of these structures on the timing, the size, is that common for seismic sequences? I think we just don't know. What we need is more examples, comparable wealth of data from a huge variety of sources. But also to answer this a little bit, we need analysis of global data sets of sequences. So we just need lots more examples. So obviously, that's the segue then into the second part of it all. So here's our 4 questions. Sure, we haven't answered these for definite for all seismic sequences, but we've given some ideas, but it might be complexity of structure that is causing these sequences to stop and start again. But now we've got these questions, well, how important are these on a global scale? And are there variations between tectonic regions? So what we've done then is we've had a look at a bit of a global analysis of clustering. And some work has already been done in this sphere, but not exactly on the question we're trying to ask. And also the results have been somewhat contradictory. So in Zaliapin and Ben Zion in 2016 have done a global analysis of clustering of earthquakes. This includes oceanic plates. It includes subduction zones, which we're not interested in. We're only interested in the continents here. And this does show that there's potentially some control of tectonic style and clustering. So we've got a figure here, don't need to worry too much. Essentially, the color red shows more, blue shows more clustering of earthquakes, and red shows less clustering of earthquakes. This is contractional environment, this is strike slip, this is extension. So maybe some more clustering in extensional environments. But Stallone and Marzocchi in 2019, so it's just published earlier this year, have actually suggested that there's no significant difference in clustering in 3 key different tectonic environments. So they've compared Southern California, Japan, and Italy. In all cases, we can see on the plots at the top here of a number of events per cluster looks very similar. The duration of these clusters, the spatial dispersion of them. And in each case, these clusters make up kind of 6 to 8% of seismicity by number. So they're quite similar, these different environments. So it's kind of contradictory, really, with these other results. And so it's not quite clear how to make sense of this. But we have quite a specific problem, which is a little bit different to those. So our approach is to do a global analysis using global catalogs. You use the GCMT catalog, and focus specifically on crustal continental events, try and strip out everything else. So we're not being influenced by subduction zone events, which we're not interested in. Those are happening on very different structured faults if we don't have that same kind of segmentation, or intraplate faults in the oceans, for example. We're focusing on specifically on seismic sequences, not just normal earthquake and decaying aftershock sequences. So seismic sequences where the following moment release is actually a significant fraction of that first event. So the first event doesn't tap into a significant fraction of the available moment. And we're going to focus on the importance to the moment budget, not just on the number of triggered events. I think that's critical. So we're saying how important are these to the moment budget, not just how many events are there. So what we need are two things. We need a global data set of continental quakes with mechanisms, so we can separate them out, and we need a method to identify seismic sequences. So first, our data set. Right, so we're going to start with the 53,000 events in the GCMT catalogue from 1976 to present day, and that's a very large number, so we're going to try and get rid of most of those. And so what we're going to do is do several steps to kind of screen these data and just choose the ones that actually do represent this continental shallow crustal system that we're interested in. So first thing we do is remove deep earthquakes, so deeper than 30 kilometers. On the bottom of the 20,000 events that we remove, on the top of in blue of the 33,000 events that we keep. So we're removing all the deep seismicity. Step two, then we're going to remove the small earthquakes. And why we're doing this is because it's below the magnitude of completeness for the catalogue. Okay, so these are the ones that actually are going to be quite heterogeneously distributed depending on local networks, etc. Then we're going to remove the subduction zone events explicitly. And this is a bit tricky, but essentially we're removing events, you might be able to see, hopefully, but have shallow dip, thrust events, shallow dipping, in the same direction, same dip direction as the megathrust. And so we use this based on the bird plate tectonic boundaries to give the location of the subduction zones, and then work out the dip direction and choose to remove those events. So that gets rid of another 3,000 on events. We've got 6,700 left. Right, still going down. But then actually we are also not interested in these other oceanic plate boundaries. So you can see that Iceland is then disappearing there. And finally, actually, most of the other stuff in the ocean we're not interested in either. So we get rid of stuff with a land mask, essentially, and only keep stuff that's either onshore or very near shore, within 100 kilometers. And so that leaves us 1,874 earthquakes that we've screened down from an initial 53,000. Okay, so now we need to identify our sequences. So just looking at time, I haven't got loads of time to talk through this, but essentially we're going to use this method that's really, really neat. It was developed a few years ago by Zaliapin Ben-Zion, and has been used on a variety of earthquake catalogues, global ones and also sort of regional ones. And this is a way of identifying clustered seismicity that doesn't mean you're making an arbitrary choice on a pair of clustered events are those within 20 kilometers or within 2 years of each other, okay? Which other clustering methods rely on that. So what you do instead is you calculate for every earthquake and all the other earthquakes in the catalogue. So for one earthquake and the other 1,873 events, you calculate some form of rescaled time difference based on magnitude and spatial distance based on, well, it's also rescaled by magnitude, okay? And you can plot the distribution, oh no, sorry, I'm jumping one step ahead. Okay, so, and then you choose the nearest neighbor for each earthquake. So what you do is, for each earthquake, you look at all of the preceding earthquakes and the distance here in space and in time, you combine them into this combined space-time distance, eta, okay? And then you choose the smallest value from all of the preceding earthquakes. So this is the most likely parent. So for this one earthquake, this one preceding earthquake is the most likely parent that triggered this event. Then, you can do that for all your earthquakes. So every earthquake has its own parent, okay? And then you can plot the distribution of eta, that threshold value here, or you can plot the rescaled time and distance. And we can see that in that case, eta values, constant eta values are going to be these diagonal lines going across there. And what you can see is that actually there's quite a clear separation of two populations. When you do this, okay, that just falls out of the data. This is the background seismicity. These are events that are not related. Okay, that's the same as this peak here, so that's like a Poissonian process. And then this is triggered events. Yeah. Same as that bit there. So then what you can do is you can determine a threshold, and you can say, okay, these events are going to be triggered events, parent, and these ones are going to be independent. We do a slightly extra step than that, which is that, of course, these have some overlap region, its distributions. So we define that in the red region here, these are hard links between pairs. Pretty likely that those two events are going to be related. In the yellow region here, those are soft links. Okay, so it could be background seismicity, but it also could be triggered event. So then, in terms of our sequence, so that's how we get individual pairs. Then our sequences are agglomerates of clustered pairs. So if we have quake 1 and 2 linked, and 2 and 3, then you link them all together into one sequence. Okay, so they're agglomerates of clustered pairs containing at least one hard link. So you can bolt these soft links onto the side, but as long as you're pretty confident there's at least one of these hard links in there. And this is critical, where the moment release of all later events in the sequence is at least 50% of the first event. So what you're saying is you're not looking for an ordinary decaying aftershock sequences. You're looking for something where you've got a large amount of moment but wasn't tapped, but was available in that first earthquake but wasn't tapped. Okay, so it was left remaining. So I can just show you an example then. That's those same plots for the global data set. This is for the Italy earthquake sequence. So now this is in map view. I'm showing you the earthquakes. That's for 6.2, 6.1, 6.6, linked by red lines of the hard links, yellow lines of the soft links. There's a couple of small earthquakes in January 2017, which I didn't talk about. That's important, but they're linked in there too. And then we can see it here in time and in latitude as well. So they're triggering events like that. But what we can also do, of course, is we can zoom out and we can look at the wider region. So we can look at the clustering in this region. In grey, which you might not be able to see very well, those are events that have not been flagged as part of the sequence. And then you can clearly pick out the sequences here. This is Umbria Marcia in the same region in 97. L'Aquila is here, 2009. It's not actually identified simply because the moment release of the aftershock is not big enough. I'm also going to show you another one, a recent one that was in the news. So Lombok, so these are the earthquakes that were striking Bali in 2018, last summer. Again, just to show you the method is kind of working. Here's in map view. This is the Lombok sequence. We had two 6.9s and some 6.3s, quite big events. These are back thrust events. Shown again in time and space. And then again, this is a region where you can see actually there's repeated sequences through time, one back in the late 70s, one in sort of 2008, 2009, and then that's the 2018 sequence. So hopefully that gives you some confidence it's kind of working in some respect. So then looking at the global sequences, there we go, there's Norcia, there's the Central Italy sequence, there's Lombok. So we've got 103 sequences globally picked out this way, and then this is everything else. So this isn't just independent earthquakes. It's a lot of them are independent earthquakes, but it's also just small regular aftershocks that don't get lumped into a sequence. Okay, right, so I'm going to jump straight to my results then of thinking what can we do with these data. And we've got them separated out by normal, strike slip and reverse. And so the first thing we can do is we can see, well, how many earthquakes are there of each type. And so that's what's being plotted on the bottom. And it's important just because we haven't got lots and lots of earthquakes. We're still doing this on a global basis, so we can try and use as many events as possible. But we've still only got events in the sort of hundreds. So I'm showing you there's a few hundred normal faulting events here, and then about 700, 600 strike slip reverse faulting events. The first thing then we can notice is that if we look at the number of clusters to the number of quakes, then actually there's not really much change with mechanism. This is pretty consistent with results of Stallone and Marzocchi from earlier this year, and you've got about 6 to 7, 8%. Okay? So that's what they found for those individual regions. So that's consistent. But we're seeing something quite different here, which is that there's actually quite a big difference in the proportion of moment that these sequences are releasing. So what's shown here then is the moment ratio, so the amount of seismic moment that is released, the amount of energy that's released in sequences over the total in each of these 3 different tectonic environments. And what we're seeing is that that's much higher, around 20% in the normal faulting environment than it is in the strike slip. Well, but it definitely is higher in the normal faulting environment in reverse, and it looks like the strike slip may be intermediate. These error bars are coming from a relatively simplistic approach. Essentially, I'm trying to get at the uncertainty inherent in the fact that the numbers are quite small. So in some sort of worst case scenario, I take the largest event, the largest earthquake in each of those 3 different categories, and I either replicate it. So what if there's another big event of this size that was actually going to happen tomorrow, and we haven't caught it in the sample, or I subtract it out. So well, imagine we've missed that event. And that's where those error bars come from. And you can see why then the normal faulting earthquakes with a much smaller number have larger error bars on them. Okay, so it's kind of it's quite a simple approach, but at least it's showing some idea of the uncertainty. Okay, so how can we reconcile these 2 results? I'll just be quite quick here. Okay, so what you can do is you can plot the Gutenberg-Richter curves for the normal strike slip and reverse events, but you can do it in the open curves here, the open circles. That is the earthquake catalogue that is declustered. Okay, so that's taking out all triggered events, which includes then basically all the contribution of the seismic sequences beyond that first event. Okay, so typically you would decluster your catalogue before making a Gutenberg-Richter plot. So that's in the white. In the blue is what happens if you say, okay, what would have happened if that seismic sequence did rupture all in one big earthquake instead? So what is the magnitude that you would have got if that had all gone in one go? So that bumps up the curve a little bit, only a little bit on this because it's a long plot. But then the crosses, which are quite faint there, so I apologise for that, I attempt to show the difference between the 2. So it's actually the difference in log-log space, which means the ratio. But basically, you can think of that as how much of an influence are they having at different magnitudes, these seismic sequences. And the important thing is that for normal faulting earthquakes, these sequences, you can see they're making a difference right up to the maximum magnitude, what we're observing. For reverse earthquakes, these crosses are kind of dying away, they're dropping down, and particularly there's quite a large gap here between 7.5 and 8 magnitude range. Well, actually, sequences aren't important at all. So the sequences are having a larger influence, the events are larger on the normal faulting than in reverse, and intermediate on the strike slip. Okay, fine. So quickly then, we're going to try and give some insight into why this relationship might be occurring, and 3 kind of possible explanations, what we might expect for that. So the first is something, okay, this is a complete straw man argument because I'm going to rule it out instantaneously. But essentially, if we're going to see some differences between mechanisms, one thing we might say is, well, is it a geometry effect? It's to do with the fact we've got dip slip motion versus strike slip motion. Those, multi-segment failure happens in different way on dip slip faults, strike slip faults. Okay, well, it can't be that, because we'd expect something like this black curve here, where we'd expect that to be mirrored from the reverse faults, and more moment being contributed in the sequences from reverse faults. We don't see that. Okay, so we're going to rule that out straight away. We could say, well, maybe it's something about the stress regime. So we know that normal faulting earthquakes have a higher B ratio in general, globally, and that's thought to be related to differential stress, and so they're more productive in terms of aftershocks in general. So maybe it's some general trend, okay, from extensional to compressional, maybe something to do with differential stress. In that case, why I've shown these little boxes on here is what I'm predicting what we might see if we look at, for example, strike slip events that are mixed in with reverse faulting events. Okay? And if it was something like that, then as you're going from an influence of reverse to strike slip to normal, you might expect some kind of general trend. It doesn't have to be linear, of course, but some kind of increase, monotonic increase. Or you could have something that was actually about structural complexity. So if actually what we saw in Amatrice and Menorca sequence in Central Italy in 2016 is correct, and that it's this structural complexity that is stopping these big earthquakes from really becoming big earthquakes, then in that case, we might see a trend that is generally increasing, because in general, normal fault networks are more complex structurally than strike slip, which are generally more complex than reverse faulting networks. But also, we might see some strange cases as well in terms of the mixed events might expect to have higher moment ratio from sequences from the pure events that are kind of pure strike slip. Okay. So let's test that then. I've split the strike slip case into two because I'm going to look at strike slip events near or far away from reverse faults and near and far away from normal faults. So sorry if it's confusing, that's why there's two strike slips on there, but it's just the kind of the averages. So first of all, just to talk you through an example, strike slips near reverse faults. So basically this is an event from our catalogue, a strike slip event that has a reverse faulting mechanism within 200 kilometres. It's quite a big area, but actually that divides the data pretty nicely 50-50. So that's the reason why I chose that. So strike slip events near reverse faulting ones, or near reverse faulting mechanisms, those that are not near. You do that, and you can see that you split the data pretty much 50-50. So you've got well, 400, 300 events, you've got quite a large sample size. Doesn't affect this at all in terms of the number of clustered events, but has actually a pretty huge effect on the moment ratio. Okay, so maybe this looks like it might be supporting this. And that with the mixed events, actually have a much larger proportion of moment released in sequences than the smaller events. Then you can do the same with reverse faulting events. That's non-conclusive, or either of those two models. But other case for the strike slip faults near normal faulting or not, again, looks like it's got this big difference. And you can do the same with normal faulting events as well. Okay, so I think this is still open to interpretation, but I see that it's not a very simple picture in terms of some kind of general increase. I think that there's at least on this basis, and as I said, these are very preliminary results, but structural complexity is having quite a big influence here, and particularly thinking about those mixed regions where it strikes events near reverse or near normal. I think that's what that is showing. Okay, but it could be a couple of models, it could be something where it's actually the general background trend. It could be a mixture of these, but reverse and strike slip events in general have quite low numbers or low importance of sequences, and that increases to normal events, but then you superimpose with that, you've got something spiky locally when you're mixing your events, or maybe actually the uncertainty is too large in normal events anyway, and we're not sure. So there's obviously further work that needs to be done on that. But what we're saying then is that seismic sequences are important on a global scale. In general, 10 to 20% at the moment globally, and obviously it can be quite a lot higher in local regions. These are common phenomena and important for seismic hazard. And there are variations between tectonic regions, that's what it looks like. And in particular, this moment release in sequences is higher in extensional environments and in regions that we might expect to be more complex. So that's kind of a summary of 4 questions we asked and what we found here. And I think really what this is implying is it's the complexity of these fault networks that is controlling the frequency of these large moment release seismic sequences. So it's implying that we're having more failed big earthquakes, more earthquakes that are halted by complex structure in these more complex fault networks. And thank you very much. I'll just end by saying thank you to all of my co-authors on the Italy work, but in particular to Laura Gregory and Tim Craig, who have worked a lot with me on the sequence stuff as well, and my 2 students, Russell Isaac Khan, 4th year student, Ashley Mason, 3rd year student, who contributed some work on this. Thank you.
How do you want to handle the questions?
Yeah, I don't know how the questions work on.
Anything coming up? Do we have a questions here in the audience? The local audience.
Let's have a look how.
Okay,
Oh,
and you factor in the ages of the fault systems, whether you're looking at something that matures over time as fault segments maybe grow, link, and merge. There's some intrinsic difference in the longevity state extension of fault systems biases clustering towards extension of fault systems tend to be younger, stop at a certain time before the mature link.
yeah, I think that will almost certainly be rolled in. I haven't tried to explicitly separate that out. I think that's one reason why we expect normal faulting, why we expect the general trend of normal faulting environments to be more complex throughout their lifetimes, in that you don't get that kind of coalescing into a single San Andreas fault or North Anatolian fault like you would, for example, in a strike slip regime. But you could try tests.
They're asking to repeat the question.
I'm sorry. But the question was how was mature? Would you expect there to be changes in the sequences of a moment release, particularly associated with normal faulting networks, due to evolution in the maturity of those networks? And yeah, I mean, definitely. That's another test you could do. Actually, you could separate the events into those in mature and less mature environments, and something that we did try to look at. But it's a bit hard to define those mature and less mature environments globally.
Okay, they got it.
Okay.
Any other questions right now from the room? Okay, I got one question. So going back to the first part of the talk, come to my mind this diffusion of the seismicity, which goes in square root of time, like diffusion, the diffusivity of 10 to the minus 14. Now, do you know if anybody has tried to include that in the ETAS model, which is this sort of clustering that tries to predict an earthquake from the previous earthquakes, including like this spreading radius with time as a spread?
I'm not sure. I don't know. Is the answer.
That would be the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we know right now, that's happened on at least 3 events. Right? It happened after Umbrian Marsh, happened after L'Aquila, happened here. So it's quite well documented now. This is happening in Italy, definitely, even if it's not happening in other environments.
Would you expect, or do you see any difference in, I guess, the cumulative self-displacement and things that you see from the segment ruptures compared to if they were all to go at once? Do you see a difference in the actual cumulative slip?
Yeah, you might. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would expect that. I haven't looked at that, but that's that's a really good suggestion, and I agree. I think you would expect your peak displacement to be in the overlap regions, right? You'd expect your peak displacement to be very high in those overlap regions if it was going regularly as big earthquake. Whereas otherwise, you'd probably expect some deficit that might be made up by distributed deformation or after slip or something.
It seems, I guess, in the North Sea earthquake seems to nicely fill in the gap, and then is also the largest displacement as well.
I mean, something I didn't really talk about is that the North Sea earthquake actually ruptures backwards through the barrier, but obviously held back, or maybe held back that first earthquake.
I guess
so they're not persistent anyway, these barriers.
I guess if you didn't know if it was a earthquake rupture or a big event, could you tell that from the overall slip profiles that you measured? Yes.
the overall slip.
If you basically just had the end product of the overall displacement from the North Sea earthquake, from your, could you actually tell that it was a multi-segment?
So the question is, could you tell from the slip distribution from the North Sea earthquake that it was a multi-segment rupture? I think you can, because that's actually what Jan Klinger did on that graph I showed at the beginning on the asperity length. Some of that data came from source mod, from a compilation of slip distributions. That's what my student Ashley was doing. She was compiling slip distributions and trying to look for maximum asperity size to see whether you can see like one bullseye and then another bullseye, where it's quite clear that the total slip dropped. So yes, I think you can pick out asperities on slip distributions.
We got at least one question from here. So, missed it now. So Christopher Jackson is asking, do we know how well at the surface the map fault length correlates to true or maximum length of the fault, given that faults can splay upwards as they reach the free surface?
Yeah, okay, so if this relates, so if that relates to, again, that graph I showed at the beginning from Jan Klinger, as I said, a lot of that is actually not taken. So some of that data is taken from the slip distribution, from the mapped fault ruptures at the surface. But actually, I think the better data doesn't come from that. It comes from the slip distributions that are recovered from seismological inversions, from geodetic inversions, that give you a better idea of the true asperity dimensions at depth. Of course, you have smoothing, and there's a whole host of other problems because it's only a model. We'll go into that, but I feel that gives you a more realistic estimate. As if you're looking at the surface ruptures, well, particularly for small earthquakes, it's kind of a non-starter.
Okay. Another quick question about the fluid transport system. So you seem to imply that the diffusion went along the secondary faults, which act as barriers, and not only along the main fault, and maybe principally along the those, let's say, accessory faults, let's call it, for lack of any better definition. I was wondering whether you know if those are somehow oriented more parallel to the principal stress direction, so that they would be more prone to, having open cracks. And fluids would propagate better on those than on the main faults because they're slightly better oriented with respect to the stress.
Yeah, so they should be more closely oriented with sigma 2. Yeah, right, because if those are oblique structures, then they're more likely. So it'd be sigma 2, but it's close to perpendicular on those.
So they would be worse in terms of fluid circulation.
Yeah, I mean, I see it more as it's probably more likely to be with being a damage zone. So where those intersections, they're highly complex geometries, they're unstable geometries actually, where those faults are intersecting. And so they're a lot more likely to be damage zones where you've just got a lot of smashed up rock and more open spaces. So it's, there was a paper that I read that said about the likelihood of it was looking at springs and where springs are located on faults in general, and they're much more likely to be at fault intersections than in the middle of faults where you have the highest slip on the highest throw. So it's known that you get preferentially fluid diffusion or fluid movement along these fault intersections in general.
So it's more
so I thought it was bad, but that could be an effect as well.
Any more thoughts in the audience? Questions? I think online, anybody else?
Great. Thank you, everyone, online and locally. Thanks so much.
Chris. Thanks again.